So these are two paintings that I did very recently. They're from 2012, and they're part of a series of paintings I did that deals with Times Square as a place. I first started thinking about doing a series about Times Square maybe 10 years ago. And the Times Square from my childhood, to put it mildly, was not as tourist friendly as it is now. It was very graphic. And I thought, thinking about it in my memory, I kind of thought that it would be an interesting place to paint, or an interesting series maybe to kind of tackle. So I began taking photos there, and I was really disappointed about it. There was no vestiges of that left. So I kind of put it on the shelf, and I didn't think about it anymore for a while. And then the more I thought about it, I kind of thought that the way to sort of approach this topic would be maybe as a tourist sees Times Square, or as anyone sees Times Square. If you're standing in the middle of it, you're kind of inundated with or consumed by advertising, by neon, lights, speed, velocity, all these different images. So I began photographing Times Square again. It's something that I kind of picked up. I know some painters look towards inspiration from other periods in art history, or other painters even, for their inspiration. But for me, these paintings are really based in film and photography, more so than painting. I started photographing Times Square again, and a lot of the photographs from the series are really high contrast, film photos, not digital. I wanted this kind of grainy effect that in my photographs that you could really kind of feel. And I was kind of more pleased with the results as I started continuing on. I was looking at these photographs and developing them in the dark room, and that's kind of when I thought, all right, this would be a good series to kind of pick up again, but from a fresh perspective. So this painting is called Crossroads, and you'll see both of these paintings are cross-shaped canvases that I had made. And I was kind of thinking about the way some people had referred to Times Square as the crossroads of the world, and the way different cultures intersect there. People from different parts of the world kind of meet there, and it was really interesting. So I decided to use that as a basis for the paintings, rather than to have a traditional sort of square or rectangular canvas. So this painting is kind of it's called Crossroads, and it's basically Times Square during a rainy evening, early evening, where you can see kind of reflections in the street. There are puddles, there are kind of rain kind of happening here, and people kind of going back and forth with umbrellas. But even though it's kind of raining, it's still kind of in a very impressive place in real life. I generally like to keep the sort of perimeter of the painting very abstract and very kind of gritty, and some parts of the painting is really built up. And it's kind of built up. I was thinking about walls in general, and when I was painting walls, I'm seldom ever painting a wall that with a perfect surface. I'm kind of working with cracks and a lot of imperfections in the surface. So I wanted to kind of depict that in the paintings, or use that to have this kind of physicality going on. The paintings are primarily in blacks, whites, and grays with kind of little bits of color here and there. I didn't want it to be a traditional painting that was just some blacks and whites. I wanted there to be some kind of color in it. The painting on the right is called Neon Canyons, and it's more about sort of the speed, the way that things are moving very fast within Times Square. It's one of the changes in that area is that it's also become more pedestrian friendly too. But that I think is very recent. I mean, crossing the street in Times Square has always been this kind of, you're negotiating traffic and just trying not to get hit. So I have like this police car that's speeding by, and everything is kind of in the painting is moving towards the center of the painting. I've kind of depicted different brands of advertising and street signs in it. You have Lowe's, you have Nokia, Bonds, which was it's a pretty well-known clothing store, but at one time it was a nightclub in the early 80s. So that's still there, and part of the word's theater and Broadway. These are all things that you'd kind of be surrounded by there. And the eyes, there's actually two eyes in this painting. I chose to leave the left eye as kind of a sketch, rough, and kind of paint the right eye more in detail. This eye is like a witness. It serves as kind of a witness, but at the same time, it's kind of like a dreamy-like effect that I use a lot in my work, and it always means something different. But in this case, it's both of those things. It's somebody dreamy, but it's also somebody that's witnessing this scene. Both of these paintings are pretty mixed media. I painted the eye freehand with spray paint. The background is done in acrylic and ground pumice. And the last part of the painting is always painted in oil. The police car is also painted in spray paint. And spray paint's a really kind of amazing medium to work with. I've worked with it for over 30 years, and it's something that is kind of unforgiving in a way, because it takes a long time to be able to perfect the use of it correctly, and there's no school for it, so it's largely trial and error, and it's almost like kind of learning. It's almost like teaching yourself how to play an instrument without a school or without a tutor of some sort. You know, you figure out sort of what colors work best, how to press down on it, what effects that you can get, what techniques you can develop. It's very much like that, but it's all self-taught. And this series, I'm continuing to explore it. It's not over for me, not yet. I'm still photographing it, and I'm still kind of finding different solutions in painting for this. Prior to this series, I also did other series that kind of talked about Coney Island as a place, the Staten Island Ferry, elevated train stations in New York, Yankee Stadium, things that are, I try to choose things that are distinctly New York and can't be found anywhere else. So I don't want to just paint a city that's like any other city. I want to find something that's distinctly New York that can't be found somewhere else. Do you have any questions?
This isn't so much a question as a comment. I really like the way it's almost a foot's eye view. You're pulled into both of these paintings and allowed it so easily. And it just makes you think of pedestrian regardless of the cars you have, which is so quintessential New York, and especially around Times Square. I think they're great.
Yeah,
I really do.
thank you.
You've accomplished some superposition here, like particularly the crosswalk in the foreground of the abstract piece. Can you talk about that process? Or
You mean here, this area?
down and to your left.
Here. Well, basically, when I create this perspective in both paintings, I wanted the picture to kind of almost go off the picture plane, to go off the canvas, so the perspective is kind of going off outside of the picture. And the way I've kind of done these abstract shapes and these splatterings, it's kind of to mimic rain or raindrops, so which you'd see maybe in a puddle.
Did you use oil paint first or spray paint? Not on just these paintings, but in your life?
Well, I've learned that, well, in making these paintings, it's very process oriented. So I kind of lay down the background in acrylic first and build up the surface. And then I use spray paint second. And the reason is that spray paint, there are particles that are kind of in the air. So if you paint with oil takes a long time to dry, and some of those particles could kind of get mixed into the oil, and I don't want that to happen.
Yeah, so I noticed like in both these and the mural you're doing downstairs, there's a lot of elements of collage in the construction of the image. Is that something that you work in? Do you work in collage? Do you do preparatory work for these, or does it just kind of get collaged together as you're going?
Well, I mean, I went to art school, but I'm also largely self-taught. I think like any artist, you see things in museums and you try to figure out how that's done. And in my case, in making a composition, I thought about James Rosenquist, for example, who used to paint billboards by hand, large scale. And he made a lot of decisions that were very spontaneous and not being able to kind of step back from his work and see it from a distance. And I kind of work pretty much kind of in the same way. But in terms of collage, I mean, he kind of takes the elements that may not at first glance look like they have any kind of relationship to one another. But if you put them together, he kind of builds the relationship. And that's kind of what I do as well. Like in this painting, I think, for example, the police car is not on the same perspective line as this. It's more like looking at a double exposure of a photograph of a police car in a city. So there's also that, again, that photographic reference. Anyone else?
You said you went to art school, but that with spray paint, it's mainly, there's no school for it.
Right.
So how did you discover spray paint?
Well, I discovered spray paint from painting trains in the 70s. That's how I discovered it.
And did you do train painting before you did canvas painting?
Yes, yeah.
Like for the NYPD, is that stenciled or is that?
No, it's freehand.
And you said the eye was freehand?
Yes, yeah.
That's amazing.
What does
Oh, go ahead.
what does the crossroads mean to you?
It's kind of an intersection in life. It means, it's like taking people that wouldn't normally be in the same room together and kind of putting them in the same context.
I find it interesting that when you talk about this one on the right, that you never mention anything about the sort of emotion that it's such a picture of, for me, menace and foreboding. And I wonder if, like, these days anyway, NYPD is not a neutral symbol of anything. And that those giant eyes kind of remind me, I don't know if you know the cover of The Great Gatsby, the famous script.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do.
But you must have a relationship to the police dating back from days, in the subway, and I wonder if there's...
Actually, I don't. Except to avoid them.
That's what I mean, a relationship in that sense, not to avoid them.
Right. But, in this case, I was thinking about, in other paintings, for example, in the series, you'll see a taxi or you'll see a tourist bus. But in this case, I really thought about, well, should I put a police car in this painting? And I thought, why not? Because that's a really perfect symbol of velocity and of somebody speeding to a destination or someplace, like, kind of get out of my way where, the siren's on and it's blasting, and people take notice of that right away. So it's more of a symbolic thing in that way.
Did you mean for these to be together?
Yes, yeah. I think they work perfectly together. I see their order to be reversed, but it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, I definitely see them reversed. They're definitely connected in that way.
They didn't ask you which way you wanted
It was a surprise, to tell you the truth. I didn't even know they were hanging. It was a surprise.
Which did you paint first?
I painted Neon Canyons first.
Can you talk about why you imagine them in the reverse relationship?
Well, it's not a big thing, but I just see like the eye kind of looking out like that way a little bit. So like from left to right. It's not a big thing, but.
Could you describe the difference of what you're trying to communicate when you do a train versus doing something on canvas?
Well, it's a completely different mental process. For example, when you're painting something large scale, you can make mistakes because people are only going to see that really for a fleeting moment. And it's so large that people are not going to really scrutinize what you're doing. I had a conversation actually with Rosenquist about that. It's the same thing. If you were to look at one of his hand-painted billboards really closely, you'll see it's really loose. He's painting with brushes that are that wide, and everything is real loose, and all that. But yet, when you stand back, you're able to read it, and it has an impact. They rarely paint billboards like that anymore. But if you watch them painting it, they're using these really large brushes, and it was the same kind of mentality. If you were to look at a subway car completely painted, you'll see that, up close, there are little drips and mistakes or, things that are not painted in completely, but standing back, it's very impressive. Making a painting is completely different. The studio practice is much more about thinking about what you're trying to say and what you're doing, what does it mean. I think the process is maybe 20% painting and 80% thinking.
So with the trains, you're kind of just saying like, hey, and then with the
Well,
paintings, it's more detailed.
Well, the trains are more fleeting, and with making paintings, it's more, I'm here.
Do you take the train movement into account versus?
Yes, yeah, I would. Even when I'm making paintings about trains, I try to depict them in motion somehow. This is how they look. They're not stationary. They're vehicles that travel throughout the boroughs, that people use, that people utilize. So I want to have that kind of sense of motion. Eddie?
I lived about 2 blocks from there about 25 years ago, and you've captured something there that just is so completely, that area.
Yeah, there's the Scorsese movie Taxi Driver. He's kind of going through, I was thinking about that a lot when I made this painting in particular, because he's a taxi driver and he's driving through Times Square, and then it was really the red light district, but he's driving through on a rainy night, so you can see the reflections on the street, and he's thinking about all this stuff and, saying all these pretty crazy things. But I was thinking about that film a lot when I made the painting.